Hey, how's it going out there? How's your week? Hope November is treating you well. Welcome to another Crime Dive, the last one for November. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases. So, as you can guess, that's what I talk about. If you like true crime, and you also want to feel better about your makeup skills, you should absolutely like, subscribe, and let's hang out together every Tuesday where I will take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old face. So, like I said, welcome to the last crime dive for the month of November. And I know, you're thinking, wait a minute, there's another, Tuesday. Well, some months this year happen to have 5 Tuesdays in them, and I take the 5th Tuesday off. So, this will be the last case we cover for November before we come back in December, specifically December 6th. And today's case is a requested case. This case was suggested to me by Burgundy Baby. Thank you so much. You also recommended the Dr. Dunch case to me, and when I dove into this case, wow, I was so horrified and kind of embarrassed for never hearing of this case. And this case is actually a pretty well-known case. It was actually made into an Oscar-winning movie. So yeah, we'll get all into it. But thank you again, Burgundy Baby. Today, we will be talking about the case of Brandon Teena. Yeah, have you heard of this case? Like I said, I was kind of embarrassed that I had never heard of this case before. Brandon was a transgendered man who was, unfortunately, murdered, shot to death by a couple of bigoted idiots. Yeah, and if that's not bad enough, there were 2 additional people who were also murdered alongside Brandon. And we will get all into it, but man, it's a heartbreaking, heart-wrenching, infuriating case. I just don't understand why human beings just can't let human beings live their frickin' lives. Like I said, we'll get all into it. Now, since Brandon identified as male, lived his life as male, I will be referring to him as male throughout the whole case. I will be using he and him pronouns. And when I quote Brandon's mother, she dead names him, always uses, the wrong pronouns and stuff. For some reason, that just, I don't know, that makes me feel kind of icky because yeah, we'll get into it. Brandon was just horribly misgendered and talked about when this case broke by mainstream media. So I'm going to refer to him as he lived his life, as a man, because that is what he is. Trans men are men, trans women are women. It's pretty sad and pathetic that we still have to say that, right? Just let people live their frickin' lives. And as far as disclaimer-wise, we'll be going a little bit into detail into the deaths. The victims were shot, so we'll get a little bit of detail into that. There is sexual assault in this case. Nothing too graphic, but there's still some details, and it comes up quite a few times, so be prepared for that. And I think that's pretty much it. And this is going to be a long one. There is a lot to get into. Like I said, Brandon was not the only one who was murdered, and their deaths tend to get swept kind of to the side because we're talking about Brandon. He was the main target of the murder. So we will be talking about them as well. So yeah, let's just dive in and get right into it. And let's talk about Brandon Teena. So like I said, I'm not going to be misgendering Brandon. I will also not be dead naming him. It is very easy to see his dead name online. It's super easy. I'm just not comfortable saying it. So yeah, like I said, I will be referring to him as Brandon, and I will also be saying that's who he was born as, Brandon Teena. So, Brandon Ray Teena was born December 12th, 1972 in Lincoln, Nebraska. Nebraska is where all the events take place today. His mother's name was Joanne Brandon, and his father's name was Patrick Pat Brandon, who was of Sioux heritage. Brandon also had an older sister named Tammy. Now, it is said Pat worked many blue-collar jobs in order to support his small family. This was before Brandon was born, and it was just Tammy. While Joanne had aspirations of becoming a model. Apparently, she had modeled some children's clothes for some store catalogs and stuff, and she wanted to make that her career. Now, Pat and Joanne were very, very young when they had Tammy. Joanne was only about 13, 14 years old when she gave birth to Brandon's older sister, and she would only be about 16 16, 17 when she would give birth to Brandon. Now, before Brandon was born, the family lived in a mobile home park off of Cornhusker Highway, and this was in northeast Lincoln. But then, unfortunately, tragically, when Joanne was only 1 month pregnant with Brandon, Pat died in an alcohol-related car accident. He was only 19 years old. Years later, Brandon said that his father had been driving drunk and had crashed his convertible off a bridge. So, not sure, because I tried to find out details of Pat's accident, and all I could find was alcohol-related car accident. But that's what Brandon would later say happened to his father. Now, on top of losing her husband and the father of her, now 2 children, the pregnancy with Brandon was very rough on Joanne. So rough that she actually considered getting an abortion, but her Catholic upbringing wouldn't allow that. Joanne was ordered on bed rest throughout most of her pregnancy with Brandon. She was in and out of the hospital constantly and received a lot of thick hormone shots throughout. On top of that, Brandon's birth was very, very late, and Joanne actually ended up having her labor induced at the hospital. It is said when Brandon was born, he was like a pretty sick baby, and he actually had to stay in the hospital for several weeks after his birth. Additionally, Joanne had gotten a staph infection and wasn't even allowed to handle her new baby. And this was for several weeks after giving birth. Isn't that terrible? Joanne also said Brandon was always a pretty sick child, always getting like a cold or something like that, you know what I mean? So yeah, man, Brandon is barely out of the womb and already having such a rough life. That sucks. Now, considering Joanne was a young teenager, and remember I said she was only about 16 or 17 when she gave birth to Brandon, she was now widowed with 2 small children. It's not too surprising that Joanne ended up moving back in with her mother, and this was also in Lincoln. Joanne received Social Security checks after Pat's death, so that's how she paid the bills for some time, and shortly before Brandon's 2nd birthday, Joanne remarried. She was 19, but the marriage would only last for about 5 years. Brandon and Tammy were raised primarily by their grandmother until Brandon was about 3 years old and Tammy was about 6, and this is when Joanne had come back to reclaim her children. And she moved her small family to the Pine Acre Mobile Home Park in northeast Lincoln. Joanne worked as a clerk in a woman's retail store and received disability checks, and this is how she paid the bills. She had tried going back to school to the local community college, but her health problems made it really difficult for her to continue her education. She was studying textile design, and I'm not sure how far she got, but yeah, she had to eventually drop because of her health. And also, unfortunately, during this time, after Joanne has taken custody of her children, both Brandon and Tammy would be subjected to sexual abuse by an uncle. And this abuse would last for several years. I read one source that said the abuse began in 1977 when Brandon was 5, and it didn't stop until 1981 when he was about 9. In fact, this abuse had such a profound traumatic effect on Brandon. Friends would later say that Brandon's biggest fear was being sexually touched by a man, especially sexually assaulted by one. It really had an impact on him. Of course it would, right? Some sources claimed that Brandon told his grandmother about the abuse, but she didn't believe him or whatever. Or at the very least, she ignored him. That was what one source said. One thing that we will get into with this case is, my God, out of probably all the cases I've done, I had never run into so many conflicting reports and stories in a case. There are so many conflicting things. So yeah, I'll try to get through this and be as clear as possible. But yeah, researching this case was very frustrating and at times a little confusing. And that was one source that said, yeah, the grandmother allegedly was aware of the abuse, but either didn't believe or whatever. But yeah, nothing was done. Both Brandon and Tammy attended St. Mary's Elementary School, then Pius X High School in Lincoln. Now, and I wasn't sure, is it Pius X or is it the X supposed to be the Roman numeral 10? I was so confused, but we're just going to call it Pius High School. Actually, when I looked it up, it said it was the largest Catholic school in Nebraska. So I'm sure that was lots of fun for Brandon. Now, Brandon's family said going back as far as they could remember, Brandon was always a tomboy. tomboy. Always wanting to get dirty, go outside and play, never wanting to wear dresses or anything like that. Always playing like little pranks, like the kind that little brothers play on their sisters. So he's a little mischievous. He loved to tinker with cars and radios. And just, really since as far back as her family could remember, always embraced like stereotypical, traditional, like masculine behaviors. Joanne said, quote, "As he was growing up, he was ornery and full of life. He was a prankster. He was a tomboy." And remember, Joanne was misgendering Brandon that whole time. It just makes me feel icky to repeat it. It is said Brandon even had aspirations of being the quarterback on the high school football team. And he was just like the complete total opposite of his older sister Tammy, who was, always very stereotypically, and like traditionally feminine, wearing dresses and frills and stuff like that, playing with dolls. Now, it was during adolescence that Brandon started like outwardly and I think like vocally identifying as male. And he even dated a fellow student, a girl, and was said to have actually dated quite a few girls throughout his time at high school. And these were girls from like other schools and other locations like near them. It is said there were many times that Brandon described himself as intersex, and he would like go on to describe himself in a myriad of different ways, because remember, he's young. Like when he's murdered, he's barely 21 years old. So, he's still figuring it out. And so he would often, say a lot of different things about himself. One of those being that he was intersex. But the one thing I guess Brandon detested being called was a lesbian. That was one thing he never, ever identified himself as. And friends said that he actually hated being referred to as a lesbian. Acquaintances said that he would say he was, quote, disgusted by lesbians. And several friends said that Brandon told them, quote, "I can't be with a woman as a woman. That's gross." So yeah, Brandon's definitely going through some stuff, right? Trying to figure out his identity, who he is, what he likes, and whatnot. Guess I'm not a big fan of him calling lesbians gross, though, just because it's like, love is love and all that, right? But anyway, it didn't matter if Brandon identified himself as intersex, transgendered, or whatever. It didn't matter to Joanne. She continuously referred to Brandon as a girl, as her daughter, would use Brandon's dead name. His grandmother apparently would refer to him in derogatory terms as well. It is said, unsurprisingly, right, that his family just could not wrap their heads around who Brandon was. And this is like, what are we at? Like early 90s, late 80s? Somewhere around there, and we're in Nebraska. Yeah, his family just had a really hard time dealing with Brandon's trans status, Brandon's best friend in school, a girl named Sarah Lyons, said Brandon faced a lot of discrimination from, just idiots who have nothing else better to do. And he was called names several times. And apparently it got so bad that at one point Sarah did take Brandon to a crisis center. He was having a hard time. So there's just those pathetic trolls who can't just, live their lives. They have to make everyone else as miserable as them. Now, to say both Brandon and his sister Tammy's upbringing was pretty chaotic and a little unstable. I mean, I already told you about the sexual abuse. And then we have Brandon trying to embrace who he is, figure out who he is, and his family and others around him just can't wrap their heads around that. So I guess throughout, his teenage years, Brandon was constantly moving homes, staying with friends, going back and forth to Joanne's. And I guess his sister Tammy's path was pretty similar in that regard. She too moved around a lot, crashing with friends, moving in with boyfriends. She moved in with one man who beat her, but thankfully, I'm pretty sure she got away. At some point, both Brandon and Tammy stayed together, but Tammy forced her brother to move out when she thought that Brandon was stealing from her. And unfortunately, this would be a pattern that Brandon would not break. We'll get into it. There was another point where I guess Tammy became pregnant with a biracial daughter, but I guess she gave the baby up to adoption. I guess she gave the baby to a nice lesbian couple who lived in San Francisco. It is said Brandon was especially devastated at his sister's decision because he was really looking forward to being an uncle. But yeah, Tammy just was not in a place that she could care for a baby. Now, during high school, some would remember Brandon, especially during his freshman year and stuff, as being a little, socially awkward, maybe a little quiet, And in his sophomore year, Brandon outright rejected Christianity Christianity and Catholicism. I guess this was after some priest at the school was like, preaching about like the evils of homosexuality and going on about like abstinence and stuff like that. And I guess Brandon did not really take too well to that. And I guess Brandon would protest against this priest, and he protested in other ways, such as disregarding the school's dress code. He would dress in the male uniform, dress more masculine, present more masculine. And during his first semester of his senior year in high school, an Army recruiter came to the high school, don't get me started on that, and encouraged students to enlist. Brandon decided he wanted to do just that, and after his 18th birthday, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. He was hoping to serve a tour of duty in Operation Desert Shield. However, any hopes of him serving were dashed when he failed his written entrance exam by listing his sex as male. It is said this rejection really bummed Brandon out. It really hurt him. I guess serving was really important to him, but this did not dissuade him from, continuing to live life as he felt, which was as a man. Joanne said that she felt helpless as she tried to help her child navigate through life, but obviously, right, her child is going through something that she just can't possibly identify with. I guess Brandon, throughout his, teenage years, just sort of drifted in and out of Joanne and Tammy's lives, couch surfing here and there, before finally deciding to move in with his grandmother and a gay cousin. And I'm guessing it's probably a different grandmother, like maybe his father's mother? Because remember, his other grandmother was kind of a bigot. And I guess it was here that he decided that he was going to live his life from that moment on as a man. It was when he was living with his grandmother and a gay cousin that I guess he decided to firmly decide to outwardly present as a male. In December of 1990, he began binding his breasts to help further present as male, along with cutting his hair short in a more masculine fashion. He even stuffed socks down his pants and was said to even have sported like a dildo down his pants just to really give the emphasis of like a bulge, And it is said by the end of his senior year of high school, the socially awkward, quiet Brandon had been replaced by an outgoing, friendly, funny Brandon. He was even known as the class clown. Yeah, almost as if being able to live his life as he felt kinda made him happy. Who would have thought, right? Joanne said her son wanted to be a, quote, commercial artist. Not quite sure what that means, if musically or like a traditional artist. And she described her son as, quote, the most lovable person. Friends of Brandon's say that he did plan to get gender confirmation surgery, but until that time, he just, wanted to live his life and continue living as he felt. And I'm not sure exactly when, but I know Brandon started going by different names, masculine in fashion. There were several names that he would go by: Tenere, Billy Brinson, Billy Brandon, before finally settling on Brandon Teena. Now, Joanne said that when girls would call the house and ask for Billy, remember I said Brandon went through a couple of different names, Joanne would tell them that they don't have a Billy there. She said she refused to refer to Brandon as he or him, refused to acknowledge him as her son, refused to call him Billy or any other name. I said this earlier, she would constantly dead name him. Quote, "That's when Brandon moved out, because he knew I wouldn't play the game. I wouldn't refer to him as something he wasn't." There's just not enough time to explain everything wrong with Joanne's thinking here, right? And yes, as you can guess, that quote, she misgendered Brandon throughout the whole time. Now, one of the girls who would call and ask for Billy was a 13-year-old girl named Liz. I guess she had mistakenly dialed the wrong number in December of 1990, and Brandon picked up. Liz apparently liked the sound of his voice, and the two began talking and flirting. Brandon said his name was Billy Brinson, and Liz wanted them to meet up. I know, we don't have enough time to go into the questionable age difference here, or no, Brandon. But on New Year's Eve, 1990, the two had a date at a roller rink. I'm not sure what happened with them, but the two eventually fizzled out. After Billy Brinson, Brandon went by the name Billy Brandon, and it said Joanne just grew more and more frustrated as Brandon just continued living his life as a man and presenting male and just embracing who he was. She would tell anyone who would listen and anyone who referred to him as Brandon or Billy or anything other than female that Brandon didn't exist. Billy didn't exist. Brandon was really a girl, and she would just go on and on. Brandon would tell anyone who would listen that his mom was just a crazy drunk who was sick. He would lament on about how Joanne really wanted a daughter and just couldn't deal with the fact that she had a son. And though he definitely faced, his fair share of bigots and idiots, Brandon was just so happy to be living his life as he felt, And honestly, I say good for him, man. Like, especially being in, Nebraska, 1990. I mean, good for Brandon, just living his life as he felt. And everyone should be able to. But even though he was embracing who he was, remember, Brandon's still young, and I think he's probably still figuring things out, because he would tell friends and acquaintances different things about himself. Girls that he dated as well, he would also tell different things about himself. He would say things like, quote, "I was born with both parts, but I'm nothing but a man now. I had the operation done in 8th grade. He told other things like, quote, "Some part of the operation remains to be done." He'd say other things like, quote, "I'm intersex." Quote, "My breasts are a deformation from birth." And things like, quote, "I was born a girl. I am a girl, but I have all the feelings and intentions of a man." Which I'm not too surprised by that, right? He's young, he's figuring out who he is, right? And having to navigate through, prejudice and bigots and stuff. Yeah, I mean, it's totally understandable. But even though Brandon was living his life, as he wanted and was happier, he wasn't doing too well in the academic department. Teachers noted that they saw Brandon could do so much more if he wanted, but he was the classic underachiever. It is said at one point in high school, Brandon was assaulted by another student, but I have no other details other than that. Apparently, in Brandon's junior year of high school, he did attempt suicide by trying to overdose on some antibiotics. And maybe this is when his friend Sarah took him to the crisis center, not sure. And by his senior year, Brandon was receiving failing grades, was constantly skipping school, and just 3 days before he was to graduate high school in June of 1991, Brandon was expelled from Pius High School. There was one article that claimed he was expelled for pranks that he had pulled, such as removing toilet lids from all the bathrooms and putting birds in the cars of people he didn't like. So that was one source, because I tried to find out why exactly he was expelled, and one source said that, and I couldn't find anything else. During the summer of the same year, 1991, Brandon met 14-year-old Heather, and he would begin his first serious relationship. Yeah, not a fan of the age gap here, and apparently he was still going by Billy Brandon at this point. And when he got with Heather, he moved in with her and her mother, Ruth. He told Heather that I guess he was a man trapped in a woman's body, and allegedly he had told her at one point that he had undergone a confirmation surgery, and then he would later change this part and say he was at different stages of the surgery. Remember I said, including the girls he dated, he would say different things about himself. I guess he would also tell her that his penis was small, but it would get bigger as he underwent more surgeries. It was said in intimate situations, he actually managed to straight up avoid exposing his, genitalia. Apparently he was always the aggressor in those types of situations. And it said he really focused on his partners in this regard. So I think by being the aggressor in the situation, he sort of took control, if you will, of the situation and managed to avoid directly exposing his genitalia. He ended up getting a job as a gas station attendant because he wanted to save money and purchase a trailer home for him and Heather. And Heather, it is said, would always take Brandon at his word about his surgeries, even when he would change the stories and stuff. She would take him at his word. At one point, not sure when, but Brandon did propose to Heather. She said yes, and the two planned a honeymoon on a cruise. Meanwhile, Joanne was apparently seething with rage and really disapproving of Brandon's lifestyle and how he was living his life. She would constantly call up Ruth, remember, Heather's mom, and tell Ruth that her daughter was a lesbian, that Billy didn't exist, that Billy was really her daughter, and apparently her messages and tone were so threatening, she was cited by police for disturbing the peace. Yeah, so not sure exactly what went down, but yeah, Joanne was apparently being a huge Karen about the whole thing. And of course, Brandon would always say his mother was, quote, crazy and all that, and always deny everything that she said. He would constantly fight with his mother, who would constantly call Brandon a lesbian, and as we know, if there's anything he hates being called or referred to, it is a lesbian. And yeah, Joanne's just closed-mindedness just really put a strain on her and Brandon's relationship. relationship. The relationship with Heather would eventually fizzle, and Brandon would have a whole string of girlfriends afterwards. Like, dude was definitely a player, alright? Like, this guy had so many chicks. Like, he was a little bit of a player. After Heather, there was Rihanna, Danielle, Lindsay, Gina, Daphne, and countless others. It was said Brandon was not really known for his fidelity. And like I said, he became quite the player, quite the lady killer. And these girls describe Brandon in a whole range of ways. So it ranges from things like, quote, "He was so cute, I fell madly in love. He was a perfect gentleman. I worshiped the ground he walked on. He knew how a woman wanted to be treated." To, quote, "He was using me. He was the biggest cheat around. He was playing games with me. He made me lose faith in all men." Yeah, so quite a wide range of how Brandon's ex-girlfriends describe him. And again, I guess no one really knew Brandon's transgendered status. Like with Heather, he would tell, his girlfriends different things about him. And they really just had no idea. Like, it is said Heather even went on the pill when she dated Brandon. And then I guess at one point, Daphne tried to claim that Brandon got her pregnant and he was the father. So yeah, no one truly knew his transgendered status, it seems. And once again, Brandon became sort of nomadic in his living situation, bouncing from girl to girl, sometimes crashing with friends. He got a fake photo ID and used it to work odd jobs, such as being a temp, being a pizza delivery driver, working at a lumber yard, and selling vacuum cleaners on commission. And though Brandon worked many odd jobs and tried to make a living, he just was always broke. These jobs just, didn't really pay all that well, and he was always hard up for cash. And this is when he started doing petty financial crimes, such as writing forged checks, stealing ATM cards, credit cards, and other various petty financial crimes. And it didn't help that when Brandon wooed a girl, he went all out. He was very aggressive, showering them with gifts, extravagant outings, flowers, candy, food, promise rings, even marriage proposals. Apparently, when he was with Gina, he proposed to her. He rented a hotel suite, got a super nice tuxedo, and threw a lavish party. He collected the photos from this party and arranged them in a photo album that he referred to as his wedding album. It is said he would only steal or forge checks from friends, acquaintances, even family, even parents of friends. And oddly enough, there are some friends who almost defend or excuse Brandon's behavior, saying he was a Robin Hood-esque type, and that when he did these things, he wasn't spending money, on himself. He was doing it for those around him. And so they were using that to sort of justify his petty financial crimes. At some point, Gina discovered that the gifts from Brandon had actually been charged to her credit card. Brandon had used it, and I think their relationship fizzled shortly after that. And soon, Brandon would unfortunately rack up a pretty healthy rap sheet. His first arrest was listed as occurring on March 13th, 1991, so while he's still in high school, and it was for stolen property. He was found guilty, fined $500, and spent 3 days in jail. The arrests eventually mounted up, but in most of the cases, the charges were either dismissed, dropped, or the county attorney declined to prosecute. In October of 1991, though, Brandon was arrested and charged with a felony check writing offense, and this was after he wrote a $186.49 check at Food Bonanza. Now, I don't know if it was this charge specifically, but I know he stole checks from his grandmother, who did report and press charges against her grandson. So I don't know if it was this particular one, but I know that did happen at some point as well. Now, after this arrest, Brandon was said to have been super depressed after a blow-up fight with Heather, and it was over his trans status, and they got into a pretty bad argument, and he attempted suicide once again, and once again, he attempted it by trying to overdose on some antibiotics, and he was rushed to the hospital. In January of 1992, after the suicide attempt, Brandon went to the Lancaster County Crisis Center located in Lincoln, and he was here a week under suicide watch, and I guess here he was diagnosed as being transgendered, along with being diagnosed with some kind of personality disorder. Records from the center, dated February of 1992, talk about the sexual abuse that Brandon had endured as a child. I believe it is here that he kind of discloses it. And it is said this is also when Joanne first discovers that her children were sexually abused. In March, Brandon was convicted of that felony forgery charge and was sentenced to 18 months probation, the terms in which said he would have to abstain from alcohol, get a diploma or GED, pay restitution of the check amount, and would have to undergo psychiatric counseling. Not sure specifically what the psychiatric counseling is about, maybe because of the suicide attempts. In April, he was officially placed on probation by the district court and was required to go to a mental health clinic as part of his probation. Remember, he had to do the psychiatric treatment. In August, I guess he spoke to his counselor about the past sexual abuse, and it is said that he left this session, particularly emotional, and he was also, visibly shaken. In early September, Brandon was arrested again. This was for forging a bank withdrawal slip for $135, which was a second felony as he was on probation for his first felony. In October, he was terminated from the mental health clinic, and their records indicated that there was no change in Brandon and that his attendance was, quote, sporadic and infrequent, and their notes indicate that Brandon, quote, does what is needed to get by. No change is noted in taking responsibility, personal growth, or attitude. In December, he was completely terminated from the program for failing to follow his treatment. Records said, quote, he told so many different versions of things, it was hard to know what to believe. Further therapy is unlikely to be of help. And I'm not sure when exactly this happened, but I do know a couple of the therapy sessions were actually attended with Joanne and Tammy along. And I guess during these sessions, Brandon was very reluctant to discuss his sexuality, his gender, or anything like that. But I guess he did open up about the sexual abuse. It is said these therapy sessions only lasted for 2 weeks before the family stopped going. And on top of getting arrested, he would also avoid court dates, always coming up with excuses, saying that, he had a funeral, or he had an accident, or he had homework due and couldn't attend. And finally, in late fall of 1993, after so many violations of his probation, a judge issued a statewide warrant for Brandon for his arrest. And it was in November of 1993 that Brandon moved from Lincoln, Nebraska to the Falls City region of Richardson County, Nebraska. And this was because he was scared he was going to get arrested and go to prison if he stayed in Lincoln. His ex-girlfriend, Daphne, had a friend named Carrie Gross, and she was living in a rundown farmhouse on the outskirts of Humboldt with a few other people, which included her boyfriend Mike and a young single mother named Lisa Lambert that we will get into in a moment. It was actually Lisa's place, and Brandon was invited to come stay at the farmhouse with Carrie, Mike, and Lisa. And using his cousin as a fallback alias, that's where Brandon moved. Now here in Falls City, he presented as male, identified as male, and everyone assumed that's what he was. It is also here that he went by Brandon Teena. And while he's here, he makes a small network of friends and acquaintances. Worked odd jobs here and there, made a lot of new friends. He couch surfed, hung out with the guys, played cards, made comments about women with them, talked about cars. It said he even shaved. And he was just, fully seen and accepted as male. No one even thought anything of it. The women who knew him described him as a, quote, breath of fresh air. According to one girl named Michelle Travis, Brandon was, quote, the talk of the town. He was a frequent regular at the Oasis karaoke bar and the Quick Stop, which was a gas station / mini mart. And it was said he really knew how to show the ladies a good time. Remember, we said Brandon really likes to woo the ladies. A checker at a convenience store that Brandon would frequent said, quote, he was in here all the time with girls, and the girls were hanging all over him. He would don the role of caregiver in his relationships, doing every bit of housework, showering his girlfriends, their family, and his friends with gifts. And as we know, this is regardless if he has the money for it or not. And as we know, he went into his old habits where he was forging checks, stealing ATM cards and stuff like that, and charging them either to his girlfriends or their parents or his friends or something. And that's how he paid for this stuff. Now, while he's living in Humboldt, it is said that he really got the eye of Lisa Lambert. Remember, she is the one who is actually, I don't know if she owned it it or was renting it, but she was the one whose house it was, and she really fell for Brandon. Now, Lisa Marie Lambert was born on June 1st, 1969 in Pawnee City, Nebraska. Her parents were John Paul Lambert and Anna Mae Lambert. John was a construction worker, on top of working jobs for Cooper Feeds and the Campbell's Soup Company. Anna was a social worker at the Pawnee Manor Living Center, which was a home for the elderly. Now, John and Anna divorced sometime during Lisa's childhood, I think sometime like during the late 70s or something like that. Anna would eventually have a long-term partner named John Lange, and I believe Lisa primarily lived with her mother. She went to community college, and when she met Brandon, was working as a nurse's aide at the Colonial Acres Nursing Home, where she fed, bathed, and cared for the elderly, much like her mother. She also tended bar at Big Mike's in Humboldt, and was described as not having, quote, an enemy in the world. And at some point in late 1992, Lisa became pregnant with her son, Tanner. And it was after a, quote, brief encounter is how it was described. And the guy was a typical deadbeat and took off after Lisa told him that she was pregnant. And when she met Brandon, she was a single mother living in the farmhouse on the outskirts of Humboldt with Carrie, her boyfriend Mike, and her baby Tanner. Like I said, Lisa allowed Brandon to come crash with her when he first moved to the Falls City area. And it wasn't long before, she had gotten eyes for Brandon. Remember, he was a real killer with the ladies, man. The ladies loved him. Brandon did his usual charm, and Lisa immediately fell in love with Brandon's offer to help her raise her baby, even adopt him. And, as was per usual, Brandon did not disclose his trans status to her. For all she knew, he was a biological male from birth. Now, Lisa claimed she was sexually intimate with Brandon, and the two did have intercourse. However, the caveat is that Lisa admits that she was pretty wasted and pretty drunk, so who really knows? And she would later find discarded tampon wrappers that were stashed away in the vents in the house. And she knew they weren't hers, and she knew they weren't Carrie's because Carrie was pregnant, so she wasn't menstruating. And she never really found out whose they were. But remember, as we know, Brandon's a player, man. He gets bored very easily. And he soon had eyes for a girl named Kelly who was a waitress at the Frosty Queen. Lisa was said to have just been absolutely heartbroken, and I guess she penned like a long, heartfelt letter to Brandon, wondering like how she had failed him and how their love might be repaired. Like, she did not want to break up. But Kelly was just a pit stop to Brandon, and he soon had eyes for yet another girl. It was actually one of Lisa's friends, 18-year-old Lana Tisdale. Lana had an older sister named Leslie, who she lived with, along with their mother, Linda Gutierrez. And it is said that Tisdales actually took Brandon in when he had nowhere to go, and he stayed there. In fact, the Tisdale home was sort of known as taking in sort of like the strays, the misfits, if you will. Like, it wasn't unusual for characters like Brandon, who had nowhere else to go, to stay with Lana, Leslie, and Linda. Now let's get a little bit into Lana Tisdale and her sister, because they are players in this case. So Lana Tisdale was born May 28th, 1975, to Leland Tisdale and Linda Gutierrez. Leland's family were long time residents of the Falls City area, and his family as such were a little classist. When Leland married Linda, it was said the Tisdales kept Linda at like arm's length. They were not really all that friendly to her. Just so stupid. When the couple split up, it is said Lana and Leslie bounced back and forth between their parents. Linda received disability payments and is said, lived with her daughters as they grew older on and off. Lana did not graduate high school, and she did not have a job, and she was said to have passed her time just driving around the Falls City area, just sort of aimlessly. She spent a lot of time at the Oasis karaoke bar. I think this may have been where she met Brandon, not too sure. Now, Lana was said not to have been too promiscuous in her teens, unlike her contemporaries, including her sister, and she managed to escape young motherhood. Apparently in this area, it was very common for teenagers to get knocked up, but Lana had managed to avoid that. Now, unlike Lana, it is said her sister Leslie was very volatile and was in and out of abusive relationships. At At 16, she attempted suicide, and at 17, gave birth to a biracial daughter she named Jasmine. Now, it is said Leslie was so volatile and was so unstable at that point that her mother, Linda, forced her to give Jasmine up to their older half-sister, Geraldine, who was married, and the couple did not have a child. And by the time Brandon entered the picture and was introduced to the Tisdells, Leslie was trying to get her life back on track and had even applied to the Federal Jobs Corps program. And she would subsequently be sent to the Jobs Corps Training Center located in Denison, Iowa. And here she would meet a young man named Philip Devine. And we will get more into him in just a moment because he is also involved in this case. Yeah, a lot of players. Now, Brandon first laid eyes on Lana in early December of 1993. Other articles had Lana stating that they actually met in late November. And as soon as he met Lana, he immediately hit on her. He was immediately smitten. She said, quote, "On a Saturday night, he asked me out. Later that night, I said, yes, I'll go. We saw each other every day for about 2 weeks." She would tell other newspapers in other interviews that they saw each other for a week. So week, 2 weeks, she's sort of changed the story a little bit. They said Brandon and Lana had really good chemistry, really hit it off. And the two started seeing each other. Both Lisa and Kelly, distant memories in Brandon's mind. Brandon and Lana's first date was December 5th when he took her to the movies. They saw Addams Family Values. And then he took her to the local Hardee's for dinner. He also gifted her a black teddy bear with a green ribbon, perfume, and flowers. And on December 12th, Brandon failed to show up to a birthday party that Lisa was throwing him for his 21st birthday because he was too busy with Lana. And that right there really ended the relationship between Brandon and Lisa. And I think that might have been at this time where Brandon moves in with Lana, Leslie, and their mother, Linda. And yeah, Brandon and Lana were described as having a really good relationship. Brandon was described as being very sweet and caring. Lana described him as a, quote, good kisser and, quote, one of the nicest boys I ever met. A friend of Lana's would later say that Lana had confided in them and had confided that Brandon's penis was small, but that she didn't mind because he was such a great guy. Although in a newspaper interview, Lana said that they would hug, kiss, and share a bed, quote, but nothing ever happened. And it's not really known what exactly, the nature of the sexual or intimate contact that Lana and Brandon had. No one really knows. Again, like I said, there's a lot of conflicting reports in this case, and it doesn't help that, people like Lana have sort of just said different things over time. But it is reported that Lana did tell friends that, quote, the sex was good with Brandon. So we don't really know. Now, Brandon actually met a lot of Lana's friends and got introduced to her friend circle, which included a couple of ex-convicts named John Lauder and Marvin Neeson. I read some sources that said Brandon actually stayed with these gentlemen at some point as well because he became pretty good buds with them. Both men were well known to local authorities. They were said to have always been in some kind of trouble and were supposedly known as the Toxic Twins. Other sources said the two men had actually only known each other for a month or two before the events of today's case. So not sure if that nickname was given before or after. So let's get a little bit into these two ex-convicts who become such good buds with Brandon. So Marvin Thomas Tom Neeson, he went by Tom, was born October 22nd, 1972, to a 14-year-old girl named Sharon. It is said that when Sharon was 15, after a 10-day courtship, she married Ed Neeson. So I'm confused on if Tom was given Ed's last name or if he was Ed's child, because the article I read was super confusing with the way it was written. When Tom was 2 years old, his parents split up, and it is reported that he moved to Mississippi with his father, who I'm guessing was Ed, and beginning in adolescence, Tom stole cars, including an 18-wheeler, described as, quote, flirting with white supremacy, before becoming an open, out and proud racist idiot. He belonged to a white supremacist group called White American Group for White America. God, these people are so stupid. It is said Tom suffered from major depression, practiced self-mutilation, was an addict, an alcoholic, dropped out of high school, and was said to have come from a childhood of abuse. It is said his IQ was in the low 80s. However, much later after the events of today's case, Tom corresponded with a journalist who said that the letters Tom sent back to him indicated that he had a much higher IQ than that. And in fact, the author's wife had even sent Tom some books which he read. So not too sure about that particular fact, but we do know that he had a pretty unstable, chaotic childhood and had a history with the law. At some point, Tom moved to Falls City, Nebraska to live with his mother, who had apparently racked up her own rap sheet that included DWIs, writing bad checks, and resisting arrest. She was also remarried to an ex-convict. Eventually, though, Tom took off to live in a homeless shelter in Washington State, but then he returned to Nebraska, where he met 16-year-old Candy Gibson, who already had a 6-month-old daughter. It is said the two's relationship was very volatile, and it was so volatile that Tom actually took off and enrolled in the army, and I'm not sure what became of that, only that he joined a traveling carnival, not sure doing what, and not sure exactly when, but he eventually came back to Nebraska and came back to Candy. Candy and Tom were married in June of 1992, and only a few days later, Tom cheated on his wife, and he would actually be a serial cheater. In the same month, a temporary protection order was entered in Richardson County against Tom by a family member that he had violently threatened, and 23 days after his wedding, he was arrested for setting 2 fires in Falls City, allegedly properties that belonged to a landlord that he had a dispute with, and he was convicted of second-degree arson. In September, Tom was sentenced to 1 to 3 years at the Omaha Correctional Facility, and he was paroled in May of 1993. So that was Tom. Now let's get a little bit into John, his partner here. So John L. Lauder was born May 31st, 1971, to Donna Lauder. He had 4 siblings, including a sister named Michelle, had a low IQ, brain damage, and also struggled with substance abuse and alcoholism. He had a daughter named Rochelle with a woman named Rhonda McKenzie. Now, John was described as a very hyperactive child, was also said to have been a slow learner as a child, and was very violent. It is said he would grab any weapon that he could, whether it be a pencil, a hammer, or a knife, and use it against other children. A juvenile court declared John, quote, uncontrollable, and he was so uncontrollable, I guess he was rejected by Boys Town, and he ended up being a ward of the state. He stayed in a foster home sporadically, attended 5 schools in 6 years, and actually spent 4 of the 6 years before the events of today's case in jail behind bars. John was said to have always been in some kind of trouble, and his rap sheet went back quite a ways. In March of 1987, so when he was only 15, not quite 16, he was charged in Buffalo County, Nebraska, with escape and theft by the unlawful taking and operation of a motor vehicle. He apparently had tried to run from the cops, and it was when they had tried to pull him over and stop him. It is said he did spend some time behind bars for this. I'm not sure how much or where, but in June of that same year, he was charged for attempting to escape the youth facility where he was being held, and he was eventually released in June of 1990. In March of 1990, there were a couple articles that actually said it was August. John was charged in Richardson County with Class 3 felony escape, a habitual criminal charge, and attempting to escape from jail when I guess he was meeting with his attorney and he was like handcuffed. But he didn't get far. He was quickly apprehended and subdued. And he ended up being paroled in September of 1991. And he was officially discharged from parole in February of 1992. In April of 1993, he was charged with flight in order to avoid arrest and resisting arrest when he had tried to run from a Missouri State Highway patrolman. In June, he was returned to Richardson County, where he did serve time behind bars. In the same month, Richardson County Sheriff Charles B. Lau, or is it Law? It's Laux. I kept looking stuff up and it kept saying it was pronounced Lau, so I guess that's what I'll go with. I mean, the dude's kind of a D-bag, so who cares, right? But anyway, Sheriff Lau moved John to Lincoln because apparently the sheriff was going to be out of town, and the only jailer that would be at the Richardson County Jail was a female, and the sheriff believed John was so dangerous and such a threat that he didn't want her to be left alone with him. John was also an ex-boyfriend of Lana's. They'd actually known each other since childhood, and it said Lana was like really the only one who could ever really kind of get through to John, and they were described as having sort of like an on-again, off-again relationship. So that was Tom and John. These were some of the buddies that Brandon had met through Lana. And real quick, let's now talk about the other player that I talked about earlier, Philip Devine. And he would end up dating Lana's sister Leslie. And unfortunately, he would have a role to play in the events of today's case. So let's talk a little bit about him, because he was also introduced to Brandon during this time as well. So during this time period, the holidays of 1993, Philip Devine was 22, and he had moved into the farmhouse with Lisa and her baby Tanner. So let's talk a little bit more about him. So Philip Elliott Devine was born October 8th, 1971 in Los Angeles, California. His parents were Paul N. Devine Jr. and Aisha McCain. He had 3 brothers named Paul Nelson Devine III, Devada McCain, and Abassi D. McCain. He also had 2 sisters named Raisha McCain and Sharon Penix. Now, at some point, Philip's parents divorced, and his mother remarried Roy McCain, who became Philip's stepfather. Now, Philip's life, unfortunately, did not get off to the greatest start due to a defective prescription medication that Aisha had taken during her pregnancy with Philip. He was born 2 months premature and was born with a damaged heart, crossed eyes, permanently scarred lungs, and a right leg that ended at the knee. But despite not fully growing out his leg, it was said Philip became so adept with his prosthetic that he could easily compete in sports and stuff. And yeah, considering he had it since birth, right? Like, really no wonder that he became so adept and agile with it. Now, when his parents split up, he first spent time with his father in California, then Maryland. Meanwhile, Philip's mother became an acolyte of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who was the founder of Transcendental Meditation. She changed her name from Phyllis to Aisha, which in Arabic, I guess means the living one. Aisha, said earlier, ultimately remarried Roy McCain, and the two left California to live in Fairfield, Iowa, where the Maharishi University of Management was located. And Philip subsequently decided to move to Iowa with his mother and stepfather. But this eventually didn't work out, not sure exactly what happened, but that is when Philip joined the Jobs Corps program in Denison, Iowa. And it is said here, he really flourished in the Job Corps. He really took to it. He became president of the Job Corps' Business and Professionals Association of America chapter and was even selected to attend a Jobs Corps conference in Washington, D.C., where he met the Iowa senators and was presented as one of the program's model citizens. In the fall of 1993, Philip unfortunately broke his left leg while playing football, and he had to withdraw from the Jobs Corps program until his leg had healed. If he hadn't broken his leg, he would have been transferred to another Jobs Corps facility in Colorado, and he would have never met Lana's sister Leslie. But he did, and the two met when they were at the Jobs Corps program in Denison, Iowa, and they began dating. Leslie told Philip that she was working on getting custody of her daughter Jasmine, and Philip told her that he would love to help her raise her daughter, which was even more perfect in Leslie's mind, since Jasmine was half black. Yeah, that was her thought process. Like, oh, that's so great. My child's half black, and here's this black guy who's willing to help me raise my daughter. Now, before leaving the Jobs Corps program, which chafed against her independent lifestyle, Leslie had invited Philip to spend Christmas with her in Falls City, and so in mid-December of 1993, it was said Philip had come to Richardson County, Nebraska to do just that. Now, it should be noted that Falls City was an all-white, openly racist sundown town, and if you don't know what that is, that's basically if you are black in a sundown town and you are seen in that town after sundown, yeah, chances are you're gonna be killed, at the very least harassed. Yeah, and this is the area that Philip had gone to see Leslie. In fact, the local fast food restaurant openly refused to serve black people in town. Remember, this is 1993, y'all. However, not long after arriving in Falls City and staying with Leslie, Lana, Linda, and Brandon, Philip ended up staying with Lisa at her farmhouse on the outskirts of Humboldt. Leslie had decided that she actually didn't like Philip after all. She said that he was, quote, possessive, and the two had sort of like broken up. But before that, things seemed to be going well. The Tisdale household with Lana, Leslie, and Linda had a cast of regulars hanging out and staying with them that included Brandon and Philip, John, and Tom. It is said John and Tom actually referred to Linda as, quote, mom, and Tom, again, a serial cheater and a scumbag, was also having sex with Linda's teenaged younger sister, her half-sister, named Missy Wisdom. So that is the setup before before the events of today's case take place. And that's the situation. Brandon is, sort of like dating, seeing Lana, staying with her and her sister and her mother, and hanging out with a bunch of people that included Philip and these two ex-convicts, John and Tom. But in very, very late November, on November 30th, other sources said it was the 27th. Either way, very, very late November, Brandon was arrested for MIP, minor in possession of an open bottle of alcohol, after a car he was driving was involved in an accident. Brandon had produced the license of his cousin, Charles W. Brayman, and signed the citation that said he needed to appear in court. He had to appear in court on December 15th, and on that date, still posing as his cousin, Brandon showed up, pleaded not guilty, and was released on his own recognizance. Now, on his way out of the courtroom, a deputy sheriff then addressed him by his dead name and asked if he could speak with Brandon upstairs. Upstairs, Brandon was shown 3 checks, which he had actually forged from his former friend and roommate, Carrie Gross. The checks had been withdrawn from Carrie's account at the First Federal Bank of Lincoln, but the checks had been cashed at the bank's Humboldt branch, and after Carrie had identified the signatures on the checks as not being hers, a teller at the Humboldt Bank was shown a photo lineup and identified Brandon as the one who had come in and cashed those checks. Brandon confessed to the check forgeries and was then placed under arrest on second-degree forgery charges. Later that afternoon, he was booked into the Richardson County Jail, only, unfortunately, he was not booked under his cousin's name, he was booked under his dead name. Now, Brandon could not make his $2,500 bail, so he was held in the jail for a week. And this right here, this incident, him being thrown in jail, would cause his transgendered status to be revealed to the public, including Lana, Leslie, Linda, John, and Tom. Now, apparently his trans status was revealed when he was being issued a prison uniform, and he was then put in the female section of the jail. Now, Lana visited Brandon behind bars, and it said when she visited Brandon, who was wearing the V-necked prison jumpsuit, Lana noticed some kind of cleavage when Brandon leaned forward, and I'm not sure if she was aware he was being held in the female section of the jail yet. I'm not sure. On the 17th, Brandon gave a signed confession to the stolen/forged checks, and I'm not sure if it was when he signed the confession, but it was right on this date or right around this time that word spread in the very small community about Brandon's trans status. I believe word had leaked that he was being housed in the female section of the jail. Then you had Lana visit him and see maybe some kind of cleavage as he was wearing the prison jumpsuit. And again, this is a tiny town, y'all, so word spread quickly. Now, it is said both John and Tom were especially incensed when they found out. They thought Brandon had made them look like fools. I don't know how. On the 18th, Brandon's sister Tammy called the Richardson County Sheriff's Office and identified Brandon, told them who he was. And on the 22nd, Brandon was finally bailed out of jail by Lana. Her father had given her a blank check to go get her hair permed, but instead she had used it to bail Brandon out of jail. However, Tom is the one who officially bailed Brandon out, on the paperwork, and signed the bond agreement. Apparently Lana was underage and wasn't able to, which was weird because she was 18, so I don't know how old you have to be. So it is when Brandon is bailed out that I guess his trans status was officially out there. So there had been rumors floating around, but news of Brandon's arrest had made the local paper. And since Brandon was booked under his dead name, that is what the paper reported. And so if they hadn't already heard the rumors before, when this newspaper came out with the local arrests and stuff, it was made official that Brandon was a transgendered man. Linda Gutierrez kicked Brandon out of her house. She was furious Lana had taken up with him. She was a bigot. And it is said after he's kicked out of the Tisdale house that he just sort of crashed wherever he could. After he was bailed out, it is said Lana and Brandon did discuss his identity. Brandon told Lana that he was intersex and was pursuing a sex confirmation surgery. Now, some sources said Lana and Brandon continued their relationship after this, despite Lana's mother being against it. I read a source that said when Linda was kicking Brandon out, Lana was, yelling back at her mother, calling her a horrible person, that she and Brandon wouldn't be separated by anyone. But later, Lana would say that this detail right here, that her and Brandon stayed as a couple after this, was incorrect. She said they were not together romantically shortly after this. So who really knows, but we do know that Brandon and Lana did stay in some kind of contact, even after his trans status was revealed. And I read one source that said when his dead name and whatnot was published in the paper, this is also when Lisa was informed of his trans status. I don't think she was aware before this, but I read another article that said Lisa was actually one of the first to discover Brandon's identity and outed him around town, but I'm not sure how accurate this is. Like I said, this case has so many conflicting reports and articles written about it that it was like borderline frustrating trying to research it. Now, like I said, it is said John and Tom were not too thrilled at this revelation of who Brandon was. They felt, quote, betrayed and angered at being deceived. It is said that John was especially angered that Lana had been deceived by a, quote, freak who was using everyone. Michelle, John's sister, even confirmed that her brother and Tom were angry at this revelation, which, I don't know, just like, what a stupid thing to get upset about, you know? Like, if you're dating the person, that's different, right? Like, that's a whole other bag of cats. But, I mean, like, he was just your friend and, like, you're angry at that? Like, being deceived? Like, I don't know, man. Like, get the hell out of here. Grow up. Michelle said of her brother, quote, he was pretty mad about it. He was upset about the whole thing, about Brandon lying to us. Everybody was mad at first because of all the lies and deceptions. He was a woman acting like a man and going out with other women. He may have felt like a man inside, but he shouldn't have gone out with a woman. Yeah, that's what this little trashy skank has to say about Brandon. And of course, she misgendered him in that quote. And at a Christmas Eve party on the 24th that was held at Tom's, things would go wrong. So up until this point, I'm not sure if Brandon was aware how angry John and Tom were. I don't think he was, because why else would he go to Tom's Christmas Eve party, right? So there's a Christmas Eve party, and there were several sources that said Brandon was actually crashing with Tom at this time when the party was going on. And that did confuse me, because even if Brandon wasn't aware that Tom was like disgusted and angry at him, like why would you have him stay in the house? But considering what I'm about to tell you, maybe it was a way just to get Brandon's defenses down. But who really knows? Because there were other articles that said Brandon was staying with Lisa at this time, so I don't even know. But we do know that there was a Christmas Eve party at Tom's, and Brandon was there. Lana, Tom, obviously, John, Leslie, and Philip were also in attendance at this party, along with a bunch of other people. Again, there are conflicting things about what happens at this party, so I will tell you what I found and try to make it clear. So at one point in the party, around 10 p.m., according to Lana, her and Brandon were just sort of like cuddled together on the couch, and it said John and Tom, who were super wasted and drunk, started like hurling insults at them, along with threats to Brandon. And in the wee early morning hours of Christmas Day, as the party wore on, both John and Tom grabbed Brandon, hauled him into a bathroom, wanting to discover whether Brandon was male or female. Tom kicked and punched him in the face and back, but I guess Brandon did manage to get away from them. He left the party and walked to a local hotel to call for help, and I'm guessing John and Tom followed him because it said they forced him back to Tom's house where the party was still ongoing. Now, according to Lana in an interview, she said that both she and Brandon left Tom's party together, I'm guessing after the physical assault, and they went to a payphone so Brandon could call Lisa for a ride home, so I guess he was staying with her. And as they were doing this, John and Tom drove up and told Lana that her mother wanted her and that she had to go home. And this was so that they could separate Brandon and Lana. John allegedly took Lana back home as Tom drove Brandon back to his house. So I don't know if they rolled up in two cars or if John drove Lana home and Brandon and Tom walked back to his house. Unclear. But Brandon said once he was back at Tom's house, Tom once again physically assaulted him by punching and kicking him some more. And other sources said that it was both John and Tom who were physically assaulting him once again. And other sources said that they had wrestled him back into the bathroom again to beat him up some more. See what I mean about like these weird articles and conflicting stories about what exactly happened? But we do know at this party, Brandon is physically assaulted by John and Tom. That we do know. Tom punched Brandon in the stomach, and Brandon would say Tom also kicked him repeatedly as he lay on the ground. And then both John and Tom forced Brandon's pants down in an attempt to prove he was actually a woman. Now, I read other sources that said John and Tom had forced Brandon's pants down to prove to Lana that Brandon actually had a vulva, and they did it in front of her. And then there were allegations suggestions that Lana had been behind this and wanting to, like, discover Brandon's real identity, but those seem to be just rumors. I didn't find anything concrete that proved that Lana was behind the depantsing. Lana said that before this Christmas Eve party, no one had discussed Brandon or his identity with her. She said at the party, both John and Tom got so drunk, they became, quote, brave, and told her that they didn't like that she was dating a, quote, freak, and they just didn't much like what was going on with the whole situation. Too bad it has nothing to do with you two idiots, huh? There are some who accuse John of still having feelings for Lana and didn't want to see her with anybody, let alone Brandon. And the sources that said they took Brandon's pants down in front of Lana said that John and Tom wanted Lana to look and to admit that Brandon was a girl. And Lana said that she shielded her eyes, but John and Tom forced her to look by threatening to keep him holding their, like, depants until she looked. And so she did, but she didn't say anything. She later said at this point, you know, she was well aware of his trans status. Remember, they had that conversation. Quote, he said he was born a female, is a female, but wants to be a male. So yeah, there's some conflicting details at this party. I don't know if the depantsing did happen in front of Lana, and unclear if Lana and Brandon are still together. Like I said, there's conflicting points in this case, but we do know that Brandon was physically assaulted at this party by John and Tom, and we do know John and Tom did depants him and pull his pants down. There's just some conflicting reports on if it was in front of Lana. I think it was. Another thing we do know that in the early morning hours after the party had dispersed and everyone was asleep, the two men forced Brandon into John's Crown Victoria car. And so I don't know if they were holding him there at the party until it ended. They drove Brandon to an area by the Hormel meat packing plant in Richardson County. And on the way, they actually got stuck and a farmer had to help them get free. And when they parked, Tom forced Brandon into the back seat and told him to drop his pants. Brandon begged Tom not to hurt him and did as he said and removed his pants and shoes. And it was at this point that Tom sexually assaulted Brandon, both anally and vaginally, to, you know, prove Brandon was a girl. After Tom, John had his turn, though he would later claim that he couldn't complete the act and instead ejaculated into a condom. And to make the sexual assault even worse, it is said Brandon was actually a virgin. Like, he had never, you know, like, been penetrated, and, like, yeah, this was the first time. And then, when they were done sexually assaulting him, Tom physically assaulted Brandon some more. They then drove Brandon back to Tom's home, where they forced Brandon to take a shower and ordered him to never tell anyone, not the police, not anyone, and to, quote, keep your mouth shut, or they would permanently shut it for him. Now, while he was showering, Brandon was able to escape out the shower window, and he ran to Lana's home. Now, I read another source that said when the three got back to Tom's home, that they actually locked Brandon into a bedroom and locked him in there, not a shower, and it was around 6 a.m. He managed to escape the bedroom, I think by breaking out a window, but either way, once he escaped, he headed to Lana's house, which was a mile away. He arrived on her doorstep around 6:30 a.m. This was according to Leslie. She said he had a bloodied and bruised lip, his face was red and swollen, there was a welt on the back of his head, shaped like the heel of a boot, and he was wearing neither shoes or a coat and was in a profound state of shock. Leslie said, quote, he had blood all over his lip. His mouth was nothing but blood. He couldn't talk. He was hurt real bad. Leslie called the police, and Lana convinced Brandon to file a report against John and Tom. But first, he went to the Falls City Hospital ER, where a sexual assault kit was performed. I really hate that I can't say the R word. It's so stupid. There was physical trauma that I guess proved the assault, and there was semen found in both Brandon's anus and vagina. However, his kit would end up becoming lost. Photos of Brandon were taken, where evidence of the physical assault was pretty stark. He had bruises on his face and back, you know, like obviously he was in a scuffle. Falls City police were called, but they decided to call in the Richardson County Sheriff's Department because the assault had taken place in the county right outside of their jurisdiction. And when Brandon went to police on Christmas Day at 3:30 p.m., in a recorded interview, Sheriff Lau interviewed Brandon. He interviewed him for an hour about the sexual assault and just seemed overly interested in Brandon's transgender status. By the way, Brandon had not slept still, guys. Hadn't slept at all. Now, the interview started off with the deputy, but I guess Sheriff Lau interrupted and took over the interview. He just couldn't wrap his head around a transgendered person and just like seemed to really have his mind blown that trans people even existed. And he wasn't questioning Brandon out of genuine curiosity, of wanting to be informed or gain knowledge. It was clearly demeaning and judgmental. There are several times he refers to Brandon as a, quote, box, and to the act of the sexual assault as, quote, sinking it in. The sheriff asked Brandon things like, quote, why do you make girls think you're a guy? And, quote, do you kiss them? He implied there was something wrong with Brandon. And he insisted, though, that these questions would be brought up in court. So, Brandon had to answer them. And he was just asking questions because, hey, this would be brought up in court. He asked Brandon, quote, why do you run around with girls instead of, guys, being you are a girl yourself? He doubted Brandon's claims of being a virgin and kept asking very probing, disrespectful questions about Brandon's sexual history. He asked if Brandon was amazed that John had pulled Brandon's pants down and not fondled him. Quote, he didn't fondle you any, huh? Didn't that kind of amaze you? Doesn't that kind of, get your attention somehow? That he would have put his hands in your pants and play with you a little bit? He asked this question 3 different times and just seemed unconvinced that a man would have a naked woman, under his control and fail to take advantage of, the private parts. Quote, you were all half-assed drunk. I can't believe that if he pulled your pants down and you are a female, that he didn't stick his hand in you or his finger in you. Brandon replied, quote, well, he didn't. The sheriff just responded, quote, I can't believe he didn't. Did he have a hard-on when he got back there or what? Yeah, can you believe these are the questions that he's asking a sexual assault victim? I mean, of course we can believe it, unfortunately, right? Brandon said he didn't know. He tried not to look. The sheriff suggested that during the sexual assault, Brandon must have physically stimulated John, to get him going. Quote, you didn't work it up for him? And quote, then you think he had it worked up on his own or what? He asked other dehumanizing, just crude, rude questions, specifically about the sexual assault. Quote, so then after he couldn't stick it in your vagina, he stuck it in your box or in your buttocks, is that right? And quote, did he play with your breasts or anything? And he forced Brandon to state out loud where he had first been penetrated. And I guess on the tape, Brandon can be heard in a barely audible whisper, quote, my vagina. Apparently the interrogation tape is really hard to listen to. It's so clear that Brandon is just being traumatized all over again and has just been thoroughly dehumanized during this interrogation. Brandon found the sheriff's questions rude, unnecessary, and so insistent that he eventually just refused to answer them anymore. In fact, the deputy who had started the interview and was now just an observer was said to have been so disgusted and so uncomfortable with the line of questioning the sheriff was doing, he actually stepped out of the interview. Brandon was later described as, quote, uncooperative. And we will never know what was said at the end of Brandon's interview because for some reason the last part of the tape was erased. But regardless, a report was filed, Brandon signed it, and he agreed to testify against John and Tom. Now, the sheriff did not issue any arrest warrants or anything like that. Instead, he dispatched deputies to the site of the sexual assault, and here they found corroborating evidence, including beer cans, condoms, and even the socks that Brandon stuffed down his pants. But even still, no arrest warrants were issued. Later that same Christmas day, as Brandon was reliving his trauma and being subjected to a whole new kind of trauma, Linda Gutierrez, the bigoted pig, told Tom and John that Brandon had gone to the police and, quote, ratted them out. And during the next 2 days, officers talked to a number of witnesses who in one way or another corroborated Brandon's story. Linda was interviewed, and apparently during this interview, the sheriff referred to Brandon as a, quote, it. I'm sure Linda did too. Brandon talked to his mother and sister during these 2 days, and it is said during this time he had nowhere to go. If he went back home to Lincoln, he was facing the felony charges and going to prison. Linda had kicked him out. We're not totally clear on the status of his relationship with Lana, but it is here at his most desperate hour that Lisa offered Brandon a place to stay. So that's why I'm confused on if he was staying with her before the assaults. Like I said, there were so many conflicting stories in this case. But we do know after this, Lisa does open her home to Brandon. By this time, Carrie and Mike had moved out, and Philip was still staying with Lisa. Leslie and him had officially broken up, and he was crashing with Lisa until his mother could send him money for bus fare for the ride home. And it is said when he moved in with Lisa and Philip, Brandon was under the impression that John and Tom had been arrested. And I also read reports that Brandon did continue spending time with Lana. He was just trying to avoid John and Tom. So I'm unclear because he thought that they were arrested. See what I mean about just some conflicting stories in this case? It was almost frustrating to research. Meanwhile, John and Tom were out looking for Brandon. They felt even angrier and more betrayed now. You assault him and then you're angry that he went went to the police. Like, on the 26th, they armed themselves with rope, a hatchet, a change of clothing, and went out hunting for Brandon. I read some sources that said they planned on going to Lincoln because they figured with his cover blown here that that's where he would go. They staked out 3 addresses they had found in Brandon's address book. He had left it behind when he had stayed with Tom, but they couldn't find him. And for days, they searched for Brandon. And when they couldn't find him, they got angrier and began to drink more and more. On the 27th, Brandon called his sister Tammy and told her everything that had happened, and that John and Tom had threatened him if he had reported them. It is said Tammy then called up the sheriff and demanded to know why the 2 men weren't arrested, and the sheriff told her that she had no business interfering, and that he would do what that needed to be done. Quote, "Mind your own business. I'm doing my job." It is said 2 other calls from Tammy to the Richardson County Sheriff's Office went unanswered. On the 28th, it is said deputies went to John and Tom's homes to talk to them about the assault. 3 days after Brandon had reported them, they questioned them about the assault. John claimed that Lana had told him to find a way to confirm Brandon's identity. And he also insisted neither him nor Tom had sexually assaulted Brandon. He refused to provide semen or a hair sample and refused to take a polygraph test. It is said 2 condoms were found at the scene of the sexual assault, and DNA evidence from that proved that John was indeed involved with the sexual assault against Brandon. Tom offered to give hair and semen samples, claimed not to have had any sexual contact with Brandon, and claimed that he witnessed John and Brandon engage in consensual sex. He agreed to come back for a second interview, and Tom would later tell John that he planned to go back later to talk to the police some more. And I guess John was confused on what Tom's endgame was, and it said John was very nervous after the police spoke with them. Now, it is said the deputies wanted to haul the 2 men in right then and there on the 28th when they interviewed them, but the sheriff wouldn't allow it, saying, quote, "What kind of a person was he? The first few times we arrested him, he was putting himself off as a guy." And of course, he completely misgendered Brandon throughout that whole quote. I read another source that said the sheriff had actually called John up on the 26th and informed him that Brandon was pressing charges against him and Tom for the sexual assault. So unclear if it was really Linda or the sheriff who tipped John and Tom off to Brandon filing a report against them. Maybe it was both. On the 29th, Brandon had planned to go to the police station for a follow-up interview. However, when he got there, he saw John and Tom, and he decided not to go in. And this was according to Tammy, who said Brandon had called her up and told her this. Brandon also called his mother, who it is said begged her son to come home. Brandon assured her that he would be home in a few days. Quote, "I'll be there on the 3rd, and everything will be all right." And on the 30th, it is said deputies again tried to petition the sheriff to arrest John and Tom, but again, the sheriff refused. On that same day, the 30th, John and Tom drove to Rulo, Nebraska, which was 10 miles from Falls City, and this was to see Sharon, Tom's mother. While there, Tom told her that he wanted to give her power of attorney over his child, but he did not tell her why. The men then went to a local bar where they drank all day, then returned to Falls City. John decided they were going to need better weapons for what they planned to do to Brandon, so he drove to his father's home and took a pair of golden gloves and a knife. After this, they stopped by a friend's home around midnight. This friend was Eddie Bennett, who lived with his wife Amy. John and Tom knew Eddie had a gun, and they wanted to take it. And so while Eddie and Amy were entertaining another couple, John stopped by, Tom stayed in the car, and asked to use the restroom. And this is when John took the opportunity to steal Eddie's .380 caliber semi-automatic handgun. He knew Eddie kept it in a dresser drawer, so yeah, under the guise of going to the bathroom, he really went in there and took Eddie's gun. After this, they headed over to Lana's home, thinking Brandon was going to be there. They were determined that one way or another, they were going to kill Brandon, whether he left with them from the home or not. And they acknowledged that they very well may have to kill others, including Lana and her mother Linda. Brandon was not at Lana's, but Linda directed them to Lisa's farmhouse and told them that is where Brandon had been staying. Not sure how she knew, but remember, it's a small community. Lana would later say that John told her and Leslie he felt like killing someone and that she, Lana, was next. He also told her, quote, "I'm sorry. I hope you all don't hate me." Lana said, quote, "It scared me because I know how violent John can get when he's drunk." And the 2 men then left the Tisdale home heading towards the outskirts of Humboldt, and neither Linda nor Leslie nor Lana decided to call up Lisa and inform them that she was about to have 2 unannounced visitors. So around 1 a.m. on December 31st, 1993, New Year's Eve, John, who's 22, and Tom, who's 21, drove to Lisa's farmhouse outside Humboldt. Now, it would be reported that Lana was allegedly in the car with the men, but she has denied this and said that she was not present at all, and there has never been any evidence to suggest that she was there. It was just John and Tom. They said when the men came up on Lisa's farmhouse, they got out of the car, walked up, kicked in the front door, and entered the home. They found Lisa, who was 24, in her room, in her waterbed. The crib with her 8-month-old son Tanner was near her, and Lisa, she knew who they were. She begged for her life, begged for them not to hurt her son. They demanded to know where Brandon was, but Lisa refused to say. Tom began searching the room, and he found Brandon hiding under a blanket at the foot of Lisa's bed. He grabbed Brandon, pulled him up, then both John and Tom started yelling at him and demanded to know if anyone else was in the house. The yelling awoke baby Tanner, who started crying, and Lisa eventually admitted that Philip was staying with her, and they rounded him up too. He had been in the other bedroom, and it said Philip was shouting and confused at what was going on, and Tom and John then dragged Philip into the living room, and Philip begged with them not to kill him, that he wouldn't say anything if they would just let him go. I read other sources that said Philip had actually been sleeping on the couch when the two men had busted in. Not sure, but either way, while Philip was on the couch, he was shot twice and was killed. The two men then went back to Lisa's bedroom, where she was holding her baby, crying, begging for her child's life. Tanner was taken from her arms and placed back in his crib, and then, in front of baby Tanner, John and Tom shot Brandon and Lisa. When the two men noticed Brandon twitching, Tom asked John for a knife, which John gave him, and Tom then stabbed Brandon in the chest to make sure that he was in fact dead. The two men then left the crime scene. They had actually only been in Lisa's house for like 5 minutes, if that. They tossed the gloves and the weapons into the Nemaha River on their way back to Falls City. They drove back to Tom's home, where the two men told Candy and Rhonda to alibi them if anyone asked where they were, and to say that they had come home at 1 a.m. Tom and Candy then went to bed, while John and Rhonda slept on the floor in the living room. And later, that same morning, shortly after 10 a.m., Lisa's mother, Anna, who lived in Pawnee City about 36 miles away, drove herself to her daughter's home. She was excited to spend New Year's morning with her daughter and grandson, and she was also bringing over some things for them. And when she came upon her daughter's home, she immediately noticed something off. The storm door was ajar, and the front door was wide open, which of course was unusual, especially in the dead cold of winter. She got out of the car and knocked on the open door, but got no response. She heard baby Tanner crying, and that's when she entered the home. She first saw Philip slumped right in front of the couch on the floor. She later said, quote, "I just kept right on going. I just went right on through to the bedroom where I knew Tanner's bed was. I went straight to the crib and picked Tanner up." She was so laser focused on getting to her grandson that she hadn't even immediately noticed her daughter and Brandon in the room dead. It was only when she had turned around, Tanner safe in her arms, that she noticed her daughter on the waterbed. The floor was soaked from the punctured waterbed, and Lisa had blood all over her face. She then noticed Brandon, quote, "All I saw was just the legs of the other person. I never looked at the body of the other person." She immediately exited the room with her grandson, went to the living room, and alerted the Richardson County Sheriff's Department, who alerted the Humboldt Rescue Squad, who got the call at 10:20 a.m. They got to the scene, accompanied by Deputy Ray Harrod, and since they didn't quite know what to expect and that this was a potential crime scene, Deputy Harrod entered the home first. He first came across Philip, slumped against the couch, his prosthetic leg in its boot, sticking out, and a coffee table lay over him, like across his lap. Upon closer inspection, the deputy determined Philip was indeed dead. He had an entrance wound in his jaw, and the bullet had exited out the right side of his head, but the shot that killed him had entered his skull above his right eyebrow and lodged at the base of his brain, near his neck. And Philip was identified by his wallet that was found at the scene. There was no apparent sign of a struggle, and at first the deputy thought Philip may have been a suicide, but as he moved further into the house, he came across Anna at the table, feeding baby Tanner. She had warmed up the bottle in a microwave. Anna told the deputy that she was the one who had called them, that she was one of the victim's mother, and she knew not to disturb a crime scene, so she had just grabbed her grandson and sat at the table feeding him until authorities arrived. Quote, "I touched only what I needed to, and then I only done it with one finger and a thumb, if at all possible." She had then just sat at the table, feeding Tanner quietly, guarding the crime scene, waiting for authorities. And alerted to more victims, the deputy headed to the bedroom in the hallway. He stepped in and immediately noticed that the floor was soaked, and lying on the leaking waterbed were the bodies of Lisa and Brandon. He could see that they had been shot execution style, and he looked for the weapon, which of course wasn't there. there. Brandon lay on his back on the lower part of the bed, his legs dangling over the edge and his hands were bloody. He was fully clothed, wearing black jockey-style underpants, sweat shorts, a t-shirt, and his sweatshirt showed a large area of blood that had been soaked through from his abdomen. His white socks had actually turned pink from the watered-down blood that was pooling at his feet. When they lifted his shirt, they saw the stab wound. It was 5 inches into the right lobe of his liver. This wound alone would have killed Brandon. They also noticed the bullet wound that had entered underneath Brandon's chin. The bullet had fractured his left mandible and had lodged in the base of his brain underneath his right eye. The second bullet had exited the skull just below his right ear, and both of these shots were also instantly fatal because they had caused severe brain damage. They would also discover Brandon's skull was fractured from a blow from a blunt object, and because Brandon's body was the most injured and tortured, the deputy assumed that Brandon had been the main target of the attack. Lisa was partly under her covers, dressed in a long green shirt, black shorts, and maroon underpants. There was a non-life-threatening wound on the right side of her chest, and 2 close-range bullet wounds in her head that were fired at such close range. There were powder burns on her head. One of the bullets had entered through her right eye and exited below her right ear, and it is said that this wound, completely destroyed her face. Blood ran from her mouth, and she had another wound in her stomach/abdomen area. Other reports said it was her chest, and her body's position showed that she had been sitting up in bed when she had been shot, and because all 3 of them had been shot execution style, authorities immediately ruled out robbery. There was nothing missing, and apart from the front door and the waterbed, nothing had been disturbed or broken. More authorities were summoned, including Sheriff Lau, who recognized Brandon right away. Forensics were called in to collect any evidence. There were tire tracks in front of the home, near the porch, but they were too tore up to take regular plaster casts of, and they actually ended up calling in accident reconstruction specialists to look at them. A single footprint and a red spot near the door was photographed, and the place was dusted for fingerprints. They tried locating the murder weapon so that they could match the bullets to it, but as we know, it's not there. They did find 6 shell casings on the floor of the bedroom, along with a spent bullet casing and a live cartridge. A cigarette lighter was also found and flagged as evidence, as were the contents of an ashtray. They also collected swabs from 2 blood spots. Now, since Sheriff Lau recognized Brandon and was aware of the report he made, John and Tom were of course at the top of the suspect list. They were questioned about the murders later that same day, and Tom wasted no time in telling police John had been the main instigator and that he had witnessed John shoot 3 people. He also told the police about the weapons they thought they got rid of, and police found the gloves, gun, and knife lying on top of the frozen river. Yeah, the river was frozen, and when the idiots had tossed it over the side, it had just landed on the frozen river. They found the gun and the knife inside a leather sheath, in which the name Lauder was inscribed. Other sources said the 2 men did attempt their weak alibi. Remember, they had Candy and Rhonda try to alibi them, but that was quickly forgotten as, police easily poked holes in it. John and Tom were then arrested and charged with murder, and in fact, it is said their juries had to be bussed in from Omaha and sequestered, and there were concerns that there was no way they were going to get a fair trial since, this area had a population of less than 1,000, and they thought it was going to be difficult to get an impartial jury, so they had to call one in from Omaha. They would both be judged by Judge Robert Finn, and the case did make the media rounds, and because Brandon had not had hormone replacement therapy or had his gender confirmation surgery, he was often mistakenly identified as a woman, mistakenly labeled as a lesbian. There were some articles that did mention that Brandon had planned on having his confirmation surgery, but by and large, Brandon was referred to as she/her, and described as a woman living as a man. Yeah. Joanne buried her son at Lincoln Memorial Cemetery on January 4th, 1994, and she buried him under the name that she had given to him at birth, under his dead name, and the inscription on his grave alludes to him being a woman. Brandon's uncle from Seattle, Alan Brayman, said of his nephew, quote, "What does it matter what his lifestyle was? He was a human being, and someone took his life away. I don't want people to say, yeah, it's okay he got killed, because he's different." Tom came to trial first on February 21st, 1995, and he was represented by Peter Blakesley. Now, Tom apparently relished the attention he was getting from this case, and had even given an interview to Playboy magazine as he was waiting behind bars, where he admitted to the sexual assault and murder of Brandon, of course misgendering him. And of course, the prosecutor, Assistant Attorney General James Ellsworth, had no trouble adding the journalist who interviewed Tom to the witness list. The prosecution had also found a fellow inmate named Larry Dean Schott, who said Tom confessed to him his role in the murders. He too was scheduled to testify, but he failed to appear. He had been released before, so I'm not sure if he ever did end up testifying. Ellsworth also had Candy testify. Apparently on December 30th, Tom had told her that he was going to get power of attorney for his children given to his mother, and Ellsworth put forth this as evidence of premeditation, saying Tom knew he was going to be in prison and wanted his mother to care for his kid. And I'm not sure when he and Candy had a kid together. Ellsworth also pointed to the fact that the two had brought gloves to the crime scene, and he said this proved that they went there to do more than to just intimidate Brandon, and they had gone there to kill him. But despite this evidence, after 18 hours of deliberation, on March 3rd, 1995, the jury only convicted Tom of first-degree murder in the death of Brandon, while only convicting him of second-degree murder in the deaths of Philip and Lisa. His sentence was delayed until after John's trial, and Tom was eligible for the death penalty. So this is when Tom did some quick thinking in order to save himself from a potential execution. Tom accused John of actually committing the murders, and in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Tom admitted to being an accessory to the sexual assault and murders. Tom testified against John at his trial at the last minute, which began May 15th of that same year. Tom said that John said that it was imperative they find Brandon and eliminate him as a witness to the sexual assault. He supposedly hated when people, quote, narked on him. According to Tom, John was saying that they could kill Brandon by luring him away and chopping his head and hands off so no one could identify the body. That was why they had gotten the hatchet, rope, and the other stuff on the 26th. That way their problems would be over. And apparently there are allegedly several witnesses who corroborate this little fact right here. Tom said after John had stolen Eddie's gun, he had said he was going to, quote, take care of Brandon. Tom said when they were at Lisa's home in her bedroom, he turned his head to look at baby Tanner, who had started crying, and when he turned his head back, Brandon had fallen on the bed, clutching his stomach, and Tom claims he never heard the gun go off. But he noticed Brandon was twitching, and that's when he asked for the knife from John and stabbed him. Tom claimed that Lisa demanded to know why they were doing this, and that's when Tom said that he handed Tanner over to Lisa, who put him beside her on the bed, and that's when, according to Tom, John shot Lisa in the stomach. She leapt out of bed screaming, and Tom said that's when he put Tanner back in his crib, and he demanded to know if anyone else was in the house, even though she was found to be laying in bed. So I think Tom's full of it, honestly. And as we know, there was. Tom claimed that when they dragged Philip into Lisa's bedroom, that's when John shot Lisa again in the stomach. He said at that point, Philip pleaded with them, promised not to say anything if they would just let him go. And he said that's when they dragged him to the living room, told him to sit on the sofa, and that's when John shot Philip twice in the head. He said John then went back to the bedroom, fired off a few more rounds. John's attorney, Mike Fabian, did attempt to prevent Tom's testimony, but Tom in the end was allowed to testify. Police testified about the murder weapons they found. The gun was confirmed to be the murder weapon, and it was confirmed that the leather sheath that the knife was found in was indeed John's, technically his father's. Blood on it was tested to be that of Brandon's. There was psychiatric testimony offered that proved John did have a low IQ, on top of having brain damage. Thus, he may not have understood the difference between right or wrong. Although, those same psychiatrists and psychologists also conceded that the fact that he had attempted to dispose of the weapons indicated that he did know what he was doing was wrong. Rhonda McKenzie also testified that in the week leading up to Brandon's murder, John talked about how Brandon had, quote, duped all of them and how angry he was. She claimed that John had awoken her the morning of the murders at 2:30 a.m. and asked her to alibi him, and as we know, Tom had asked the same of his wife, although she testified that it was 3:30 a.m. when she had been woken up. John took the stand in his own defense against Fabian's wishes, because he wanted to refute Tom's testimony, and he denied everything Tom had said. He claimed he was completely innocent and had actually been asleep in the car as Tom had gone into Lisa's farmhouse. However, during his testimony, he caught himself in several lies, contradicted himself, and contradicted the testimonies of other witnesses who were in better standing with the community, and it is said he really did more harm than good. good. In the end, no one knew of what John said, what was the truth, and what was a lie. And on May 25th, after 5 hours of deliberation, John was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of using a deadly weapon, and 1 count of burglary. And also, as an aside, during John's trial, Brandon's sister Tammy actually gave birth to a daughter who she named Bailey. In the end, Tom was ultimately sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms, and this was because of his testimony, and John was sentenced to death. Tom is currently serving his sentence at the Lincoln Correctional Center, and John is serving his sentence at the Tecumseh State Correctional Institution. Now, Brandon's case did make some headlines, and was referenced in media, I mentioned that earlier, and they are certainly horrific. One AP headline read, quote, "A woman who had posed as a man and dated women was found shot to death on Friday, 2 weeks after residents of the rural area learned her true identity," the authorities said today. During John's trial, Saturday Night Live, SNL, aired a Weekend Update with Norm Macdonald segment where he joked, quote, "And finally, in Falls City, Nebraska, John Lauder has been sentenced to death for attempting to kill 3 people in what prosecutors called a plot to silence a cross-dressing female who had accused him of sexual assault." Now, this might strike some viewers as harsh, but I believe everyone involved in this story should die. This segment was met with harsh criticism from LGBT communities and groups, including organizations such as the Transsexual Menace, who all threatened to picket and boycott SNL if they did not apologize. NBC later reviewed the segment and agreed it should never have aired, and they said that they would ensure similar incidents did not happen in the future. Yeah, because that's what corporations care about, right? Now, both John and Tom appealed their convictions, and in September 2007, Tom finally recanted his testimony about John. He said he alone had shot Brandon, and that John himself did not commit any of the actual murders. In a sworn affidavit that John was trying to use to get a new trial, Tom stated, quote, "I am the person who shot and stabbed Brandon Teena." He, of course, dead-named him. "I am the person who shot Philip Devine. I am the person who shot Lisa Lambert." Tom also admitted he had testified against John in order to cut a sweet deal and avoid the death penalty. And according to a July 2007 report from Tom's mental health counselor, Tom admitted to being the, quote, "trigger man," and told the counselor, quote, "The idea for the murders was initially John's idea. But according to the report, quote, John's gun jammed, and Tom proceeded to shoot all 3 victims." So there was only one gun, so like what? Did it jam in John's hand and so Tom just took it from him and proceeded to do the murders? The report concluded that, quote, "Tom said that he did not have any problem admitting to the murders, but wanted John to acknowledge John's involvement with the crime. And due to double jeopardy laws, Tom could never be charged for this admission, but John could use it and try and get a new trial. He was actually looking for complete exoneration." Yeah, now he was saying he was completely innocent. Now, when this revelation happened in 2007 of Tom admitting that he had lied about John's involvement, Joanne, Brandon's mother, was very tired, didn't really know what to believe anymore. She said, quote, "I'm confused. I don't understand if Tom did it or John did it. I would have bet money on John. He just looked so guilty." In 2009, using Tom's confession, John appealed his sentence, claiming he was completely innocent, but the Nebraska Supreme Court rejected this argument. They held, and have since held, that even with Tom's revised testimony, both John and Tom were involved in the murders, and the specific identity of the shooter or shooters was legally irrelevant. In August of 2011, a 3-judge panel of the 8th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals rejected John's appeal in a split decision. In October, they also rejected John's request for a rehearing before the panel or before the full 8th Circuit. John then petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court to hear his case, but they declined to review it on March 19th, 2012. John petitioned them again, but he was rejected again on April 23rd, and this left John's conviction standing. And in 2015, Nebraska actually abolished the death penalty, leaving John to be sentenced to life in prison. And on January 22nd, 2018, John was denied a 3rd appeal by the U.S. Supreme Court. Joanne ended up suing Richardson County and Sheriff Lau for $350,000 for failing to prevent the death of Brandon and being an indirect cause. She blamed the sheriff for not arresting John and Tom when his deputies wanted to. She told the media, quote, "I think the police are bigots. They were referring to him as Thing in jail. They, John and Tom, should have been arrested the first time he reported the assault." The sheriff denied her accusations, saying he just didn't want to jump the gun and compromise the case. The case was heard in Falls City in September of 1999, and Joanne won. However, she was only awarded $80,000, but then District Court Judge Orville Cody reduced her payment by 85% based on the responsibility of Tom and John, and by 1% for Brandon's alleged contributory negligence due to his lifestyle. Yeah, so because he was who he was, this judge was blaming Brandon in part for his own murder. This left Joanne with $17,360.97, and in 2001, the Nebraska Supreme Court reinstated the full $80,000 amount, and this was for, quote, mental suffering. They then awarded her an additional $6,223.20 for funeral costs, and they said the fact that the sheriff informed the men of the report and then failed to protect the victim proved his negligence. They also criticized the sheriff's attitude, specifically his attitude in the interview tape with Brandon, calling him, quote, demeaning, accusatory, and intimidating. In October of 2001, they also awarded Joanne an additional $12,000, $5,000 for wrongful death, and $7,000 for the intentional infliction of emotional distress. Joanne was also vocally critical of Lana, accusing her of betraying Brandon because she told the killers where he was staying, although reports seem to indicate that it was actually Linda who had told them. Sheriff Lau was also criticized for his blasé attitude and disregard for Brandon by, the public and media. After the case, he was voted out of office, but he served as commissioner of Richardson County just a few years after Brandon's murder. When his term ended, he worked as a corrections officer at the Nebraska State Penitentiary where John was on death row at the time, and in 2010, he served as part of his community's village board council before retiring and driving a school bus. He has refused to speak of Brandon or his case or his own actions. On the case's 20th anniversary, he swore at a reporter who tried to contact him. He told another reporter who tried to call him, quote, you people are a pain in the ass, and he hung up. One of the people who served as Richardson County Sheriff, Randy Hauser, said of Sheriff Lau, quote, he has rationalized his role to the point where he's blameless. I'm sure it's a defense mechanism. In 1999, the case became the subject of the movie Boys Don't Cry, where Hilary Swank won her Oscar for her portrayal of Brandon. In 2000, in her acceptance speech, Hilary thanked Brandon and properly identified him as he and him, and apparently this set Joanne off. She vehemently objected to Hilary Swank properly identifying her child. Quote, this set me off. She should not stand up there and thank my child. I get tired of people taking credit for what they don't know. You want to talk about what you don't know? You can't even properly identify your child. Now, the film has been both praised and criticized. Praised for bringing Brandon's case to the spotlight, to the mainstream, but criticized for omitting Philip entirely, for placing Lana at the crime scene, and for casting Hilary Swank as Brandon. That particular fact, I'm not a fan of. I'm not a fan of these, stringent casting things. So what, can gay actors only portray gay characters? Where's the line here? So that particular criticism, I don't agree with. In an interview in 2013, Joanne said that she accepted Brandon's identity and no longer objected to him being referred to as such in media. She said she was unhappy with how Boys Don't Cry portrayed the whole situation, but she said, quote, it gave them, gender and transgender advocates in the community, a platform to voice their opinions. And I'm glad of that. There were a lot of people who didn't understand what it was Brandon was going through. We've come a long way since then. When asked how her son's murder affected her now, she said, quote, I wonder how my life would be different if he was still with me. He would be such a joy to have around. He was always such a happy kid. I imagined him being a happy adult. And if being happy meant him living as a man, I would be fine with that. Once again, she was dead naming and misgendering Brandon throughout all of that quote, but it seems like she was eventually coming on board. Not sure how she feels today in 2022. I tried finding the latest information on her view of everything, and this 2013 interview was the latest I could find. Lana ended up suing Fox Spotlight Pictures, who I think had produced and or distributed Boys Don't Cry, claiming invasion of privacy for the film using her name and likeness without her consent, and she claimed that the film portrayed her as a, quote, lazy, white trash, and a skanky snake. She also claimed the film falsely portrayed her and Brandon's relationship after his transgender status was revealed. She claimed she did not continue the relationship and said the film depicted her at the crime scene, which she was not. She attempted to stop the film's release altogether, but obviously that didn't happen. She eventually settled her lawsuit in 2000 for an undisclosed sum of money. Lana, Leslie, and Linda were actually the subjects of antagonism in the area and by media because they were viewed as the ones to blame other than John and Tom for the triple murder because, they told the men where Brandon was staying. They knew the men were drunk as balls, knew how violent they were, knew that they were angry at Brandon. Snooks Hayes, who was Lisa's aunt and wife of one of the investigators who actually arrested John and Tom, said, quote, "I'm hateful." She said Lana had to have known something was wrong that night when the men stopped by, and she had to have known that something bad was going down, and if she had just phoned Lisa, quote, 3 people wouldn't be dead today. And the Tisdales didn't really do themselves any favors with their behavior in court. Leslie was very crude and brash and honestly, really trashy with her statements, accusing Philip of, quote, wanting it now and just being very vulgar. She constantly tried to get John's attention during his trial and talk to him. Lana looked very made up for Tom's trial, and some, described it as if she was trying to, be discovered or something. But by the time John's trial came around, she looked really disheveled and haggard, and it was because there were rumors going around that she was at the crime scene, and she was scared that Tom, through his testimony, was going to say that she was there. Both Lana and Leslie often sat with the Lauder and Neeson families because there was a lot of animosity towards them in the courtroom. They were described as, quote, "The Tisdales are like paper boats. They've got no rudders. They just float through life any which way." And lost in the entire shuffle of the case was, of course, Lisa and Philip and their murders. There have been accusations of racism in the omission of Philip's murder. Remember, he wasn't even mentioned, shown, or acknowledged in Boys Don't Cry. But Lisa's erasure may have come from, her family. They were really quiet throughout the whole thing. It is said her parents, along with her mother's partner, just sat quietly, quote, with dignity throughout the trials. And they didn't really make themselves available to the media like Joanne and the Tisdales had. They had also chose to sit off by themselves in the courtroom during the trials, so that could be another reason why Lisa's death was sort of omitted from the headlines. Scholar Susan Stryker, who was referred to in one article I read as the Dean of Trans Studies, has said of Brandon's murder, quote, "One of the things that made the murder so tragic is that Brandon was so young, still figuring himself out, and we will never know what his path, his future would have taken. The violence, in many ways, was against Brandon as the bearer of youthful fluidity of gender possibilities being brutally foreclosed." There are also those who wonder if Philip and Lisa were killed simply to eliminate witnesses, or if there's some racial animosity towards Philip. Remember, Tom was a racist, and the Falls City region was a sundown town and was openly racist at the time. Lisa had also been intimate with Brandon, and there are some who speculate if maybe she wasn't killed for being a traitor or whatnot. There's been no research to corroborate this, and some are critical of the fact that, Lisa and Philip's murders just sort of got swept under the rug in the chaos of the case. But guys, that was the sad, tragic tale of Brandon Teena, who was murdered along with Lisa and Philip. And all because a couple of inbred hicks couldn't just accept someone just living their life. What do you mean you felt betrayed or demeaned? He was your friend, dude. Who cares? Who cares? No, I just don't get idiots like that. I really don't, Yeah, thank you so much, Burgundy Baby, for suggesting this case to me. I was so heartbroken when I came across it. And like I said, I can't believe I didn't know about this case. I was only 11 or 12 when Boys Don't Cry came out, so I wasn't even sure what that movie was about. I just know that Hilary Swank won her Oscar for it. But please tell me your thoughts on this case. I never understand bigotry, dude. I just don't understand why you can't just let people live their lives. I really don't. And it's especially heartbreaking that poor Philip and Lisa, Lisa, she was trying to give Brandon a home. She was trying to be his friend. And poor Philip, man, wrong place at the wrong time. It's just tragic, man. It's so infuriating. At least least those two idiots are in prison for life. And yeah, man, just tell me your thoughts on this case. Isn't it just tragic? Like, poor Brandon, man. If only he had lived to see today. Like, I know there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but at least the discussion of trans issues is like discussed more, you know? And at least today he would have had the internet, so he would have at least been able to connect with people who also were, you know, trans. I don't know, it's just so sad. And I hope Joanne has gotten over this nonsense. Like, considering she has left Brandon's grave with his dead name and misgendered. I don't know. But yeah, guys, that was the last case for November. I think it's a good case to sort of sit on and sort of think about. It's so sad that, you know, we still deal with this stuff today, man. There's still violence against trans people all across this country, all across the world. And it's just so freaking stupid. Just let people live their frickin' lives, you know? I don't know. Well, I will see you guys next month. I really need this break. I am catching up on all kinds of stuff. I plan on introducing some new stuff in the channel next year. So yeah, I will be hard at work at that. In the US, it is Thanksgiving this Thursday, so happy Turkey Day to my fellow Americans. And yeah, I hope you guys have a safe, fun holiday. Take care of yourselves out there. Remember, man, God, don't be a prick. Don't be an inbred hick loser who can't let people live their lives like John and Tom, you know? Just don't be a dick, all right? Alrighty, guys, I will see you next month. Take care. Bye-bye.